In this video, which is the final video for the testing section, you're going to learn some pretty advanced testing techniques. We'll be using this throughout the rest of these sections as we build real-world apps, but for now, I want to start off with an example. We'll worry about the vocabulary for what I'm about to do in just a second. For the moment, all I want you to do is close all your files and create a new directory in the root of the project. Right here, I'm going to make a new folder called Spies. We'll talk about what exactly spies are and how they relate to testing in just a moment. Inside of Spies, we're going to make two files, app.js. This is the file that we'll be testing. And a second one called db.js. In our example, we can just assume that this is a file that has all sorts of methods for saving and reading data from the database. Inside of db.js, we're going to create one function using module.exports. I'm going to create a function called SaveUser. SaveUser is going to be a really simple function. It's going to take a user object, and we're just going to go ahead and print it to the screen using console.log. I'm going to print a little message saving the user, and I'll also print out the object right here. Now, obviously, this is not a real save user function. We do not interact with any sort of database, but it is going to illustrate exactly how we're going to be using Spies to test our code. Next up, we're going to fill out app.js, and this is the file we're actually going to be testing. Inside of app.js, we're going to create a new function, module.exports.handle signup. In the context of an application with authentication, handle signup might take an email and a password. Maybe it goes ahead and checks if the email already exists. If it doesn't, great, it saves the user and then it sends some sort of welcome email. We can go ahead and simulate that by creating an arrow function that takes an email and a password. Inside of here, we're going to leave 3 comments. These will be things that the function is supposed to do. It's going to check if the email already exists. It's going to save the user to the database. And finally, we're going to send that welcome email. Perfect. Now, these 3 things are just an example of what a handle signup method might actually do. When we go through the real process, you'll see how it pans out. Now, we already have one of these in place. We just created SaveUser. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and call SaveUser instead of having this second comment. Right here, I'm going to call it db.SaveUser. It's not imported just yet, but that's not going to stop us from calling it. We'll add the import in just a second. And I'm going to pass in what it expects, the user object. Now, I don't have a user object. I have an email and a password. I can create a user object by setting email equal to the email argument and setting password equal to the password argument, just like this. Excellent. Now, one important thing to note, inside of ES6, if the property name on an object you're setting is the same as a variable name, you can actually define it like this. In this example, since I'm setting a password property and I'm setting it equal to whatever's on the password variable, there's no need to have both. This ES6 syntax also allows us to create a much simpler looking call. There's no need to have it on multiple lines since it's pretty reasonable in length. Awesome. Now we can load in DB by creating a variable, calling it db, and setting it equal to require db.js. That is a local file, so we're going to start it with a // to grab it from the current directory. Now, this is an example of something that we're going to want to test inside of our code. We have a handle signup method. It takes an email and a password, and we need to make sure that db.SaveUser works as well. That is a big problem. And this means that we're not just testing handle signup, we're testing handle signup, we're testing our code that checks if an email exists, maybe that lives in another function, we're checking if the SaveUser function works as expected, we're checking if the welcome email sends. That is a real pain. What we're going to do instead is fake this function. It's never actually going to execute the code inside of here, but it is going to let us verify that when we run handle signup, SaveUser gets called. We're going to do this with something called Spies. Spies let you swap out a real function like SaveUser for a testing utility. When that test function gets called, you can create various assertions about it, making sure it was called with certain arguments. Let's go ahead and start exploring that. Right here, I'm going to make a new file called app.test.js, and we can start playing around with Spies. Now, Spies do come built in with expect, so all we have to do is load it in. const expect equals require expect. And from here, we can create our very first test. I'm going to go ahead and put this in a describe block so it's easier to find over in our test output. I'll call this describe block app, and I'll add my callback function, and now I can add my individual test cases. First up, we're going to call it, and we're going to make a new test where we can just play around with spies. We won't be calling the function in our app.js file just yet. It should call the spy correctly. In order to visualize how spies work, we're going to go through the most basic example we can. First up, creating a spy. To create a spy, you're going to call a function expect dot create spy. Create spy is going to return a function, and that is the function that you're going to swap out for the real one, which means we do want to store that in a variable. I'm going to create a variable called spy, setting it equal to the return result. And now we would inject spy into our code, whether it's app.js or some other function, and we would wait for it to get called. We can go ahead and call it directly right here. I'm going to call spy just like this. Next up, we can set up a series of assertions using expects spies assertions. If you head over to your browser and go to the expect documentation, mjackson expect, I have it right here. We can scroll down to the spies section where they talk about all of the assertions you have access to. It's pretty far down on the page. You should start seeing spies in the method names, and that's when you know you've gotten there. Right below, to include and to exclude keys, I have to have been called. This is our first assertion with spies. We can assert that our spy was indeed called. Over inside of Atom, we're going to go ahead and do that by calling expect and passing in the spy, just like this. Then I'm going to add the assertion, to have been called. This is going to cause the test to pass if spy was called, which it was, and it'll cause the test to fail if the spy was never called. I can run the test suite inside of the terminal using npm run test-watch, and this is going to kick off the tests using node mon. Right here, we have all of our test cases, and under the app one, we have should call the spy correctly. It did indeed pass, which is fantastic. Now let's go ahead and comment out the line where I call spy. This time around, the test should fail because the spy was never actually called. And right here, we see spy was not called. Now, checking if a spy was called or not called is great, but we can get even more detail out of our assertions. For example, what if I call the spy with the name Andrew and the age 25? And I want to verify that the spy was not just called, but was called with these arguments. Well, luckily, we have an assertion for that too. Instead of to have been called, we can call to have been called with. This lets us pass in some arguments and verify the spy was indeed called with those arguments. Right here, I'm going to assert that my spy was called with Andrew and the number 25. When I save the file and the test cases restart, I should see all my tests passing, and that's exactly what I get. Now, if the spy was not called with this data, I'm going to go ahead and remove 25, and we rerun the test suite. The test is going to fail. It's going to give you an error message letting you know that the spy was never called with Andrew and 25. This is causing the test to fail, which is fantastic. Now, there are plenty of other assertions we can use with our spies. You can find them over in the expect docs. We have to have been called, which we used, to not have been called, verifying that a spy was not called. Then we have to have been called with, which we also used. Down below, you can see there's a lot more to spies as well. How to create spies, which we've already done, and a few other methods, which we're not going to explore now, although they could be useful in the future. For our purposes, we need a spy so we can simulate that function inside of app.js save user. We need a way to replace this function with a spy. Then we can verify that when handle signup gets called, it does indeed call save user. It doesn't need to actually go through the process over in db.js. This is not important to our tests. The only thing that is important is that the function was called with the correct arguments. To do that, we're going to look at an npm module called rewire, which lets us swap out variables for our tests. In our case, in our test file, we'll be able to replace the db object with something else completely. Then, when the code runs, instead of calling db.saveuser, as defined over here, it's going to be calling db.saveuser, which will be a spy. To get started, we do need to install Rewire over in the terminal. It's a fantastic test utility. It's pretty essential for testing functions with side effects like the one we have here. I'm going to run npm install. The module name itself is called Rewire, and we're going to be grabbing the most recent version as of this filming, version 2.5.2. This is a test-specific module. We're not going to need it for our application to run regularly, so we will be using the save dev flag to add it to our package.json dependencies list. Once the module is installed, we can get started using it, and it's pretty simple to set up. Over inside of app.test.js, we can start by loading it in. Up at the very top, I'm going to create a new constant. This one will be called Rewire, and we're going to set it equal to the return result from requiring Rewire. Now, the way that Rewire works is it requires you to use Rewire instead of require when you're loading in the file that you want to mock out. For this example, we want to replace DB with something else, so when we load an app, we have to load it in a special way. I'm going to make a variable called app, and we're going to set it equal to Rewire, followed by what we would usually put inside of require. In this case, it's a relative file, a file that we created, ./app is going to get the job done. Now, Rewire loads your file through require, but it also adds two methods on to app. These methods are app.__set__ and app.__get.___. We can use these to mock out various data inside of app.js. That means we're going to make a simulation of the DB object, the one that comes back from db.js, but we'll swap out the function with a spy. Inside of our describe block, we can kick things off by making a variable. This variable is going to be called db, and we're going to set it equal to an object. The only thing we need to mock out in our case is save user. Right here, I'm going to define save user. Then I'm going to go ahead and set it equal to a spy by creating one using expect.createSpy, just like we did down below. And now we have this DB variable, and the only thing left to do is replace it, and we do that using app.__set__. This takes two arguments. The first one is the thing you want to replace. We're trying to replace DB, and we're trying to replace it with the DB variable, which is our object that has the save user function, just like we have over here. With that in place, we can now write a test that verifies that handle signup does indeed call save user. Down below, I'm going to call it should call save user with user object. Then we can pass in our function. This is what's going to actually run when the test gets executed, and there's no need to use any asynchronous done arguments. This is going to be a synchronous test for now. Inside of here, we can come up with an email and a password that we'll pass in to handle signup right here. I'm going to make a variable called email, setting it equal to some email, andrew@example.com, and we can do the same thing with a password, var password. I'll set that equal to 123ABC. Next up, we are going to call handle signup. This is the function we want to test. I'm going to call app.handle signup, passing in our two arguments, email and password. Now at this point, handle signup is going to get executed. That means the code over here is going to run and it's going to fire db.saveUser. But db.saveUser is not the method in db.js. It's a spy instead, which means we can now use those assertions we just learned about. Right here inside of the test case, I'm going to use expect to expect something about db, the variable right here, .saveUser, which we set equal to a spy. I'm going to call .to have been called with. And I'm going to call this with an object because that is what db.js should have been called with. We'll use that same ES6 shortcut, email, comma, password. This creates an email attribute set to the email variable and a password attribute set to the password variable. With this in place, we can now save our test file, and over in the terminal, I can restart the test watch script by using the up arrow key twice to rerun our npm run test watch command. This is going to kick off our test suite, starting up all of our tests. And right here, we see should have called the spy correctly fails. That's because we had previously messed up the test case to make sure it failed. I'm going to add that back, but that's not important because the test case we did just create, that did indeed pass. Should call save user with the user object. And this is fantastic. We now have a way to test pretty much anything inside of Node. We can even test functions that call other functions, verifying that the communication happens as expected. And all of this can be done using spies. Now, I understand that the concepts in this video in particular can be a little hard to grasp, especially when you're not using it in the context of a real application. And that's why we are done with the testing section and we're going to move on creating real-world apps. Most notably, we're going to create a to-do REST API and we're going to make a real-time application with sockets. That is all coming up next, and we will be using testing throughout the rest of the course. I am super excited to get to it, so I will see you next time as we start building our REST API.